The ocean covers 70% of the Earth's surface. It generates over half of the oxygen we breathe every day. Some of the most biodiverse places on Earth are found in the ocean's coral reefs. As a society, we depend on the ocean.
Welcome back, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So coral reefs do so much for us. They shelter our coast from the impacts of storms. They provide nurseries for fisheries that nourish our communities. And they contribute an estimated $1 trillion to the global economy. But nearly 75% of these critical ecosystems are at threat from a changing climate, overfishing, pollution, acidification, and a myriad of other impacts. Vigilance against these threats and hope for new solutions is why 2018 was named the International Year of the Reef. Congresswoman Madeleine Bordallo is all too familiar what's at stake for coral reefs. As a delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives from Guam, she sees firsthand the importance of corals to the people and the economy. I want to thank the Congresswoman for joining us this morning to provide opening remarks for the Recovering Coral Reefs panel and to announce important next steps for the protections of these critical ecosystems. Congresswoman, please let me welcome you to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Half a day. That's our traditional greeting on Guam. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Madeleine Bordallo, and I have the privilege of representing the U.S. territory of Guam in Congress since 2003. It is a pleasure to join you here for the Capitol Hill Ocean Week. And I want to extend a special appreciation to the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for organizing this important week-long event. 2018 is the International Year of the Reef, so this session on recovering coral reefs is especially important. Healthy, resilient coral reefs are natural infrastructure, providing essential protections for island and coastal communities. Without the reefs to absorb the blunt force of wave action, many Pacific islands and coastal communities could simply wash away. For Guam, other Pacific islands, and the communities across the United States, and indeed all over the world, coral reefs are also integral to our tourism economies, fisheries, and our way of life. So caring for our nation's coral reefs is not just an environmental issue, but rather it is a necessity. We are the stewards of this irreplaceable natural infrastructure. I just returned from Guam a day ago, and I will voice what everyone in this room knows already. Our coral reefs are in crisis. To date, 25 at-risk coral species have required listing under the Endangered Species Act. 2017 marked a prolonged, unprecedented global coral bleaching event. Guam and the Western Pacific, long home to some of the most well-preserved reefs in the world, were impacted severely, as was the Coral Triangle. The threats facing coral reef ecosystems are many: ocean acidification, warming sea temperatures, coastal pollution, invasive species, overfishing, and other stressors linked to global climate change and human activity. These challenges are daunting and cannot be solved overnight. but there are actions that we can take right now to make real, measurable progress. Congress needs to take action to better protect our nation's irreplaceable coral reefs and support efforts for their recovery. And so today, I am reintroducing my Coral Reef Conservation Reauthorization Act with 13 bipartisan original co-sponsors. This comprehensive bill builds on legislation that I have sponsored in the House since 2009. Our bill would reauthorize, update, and expand the Coral Reef Conservation Act of 2000 to reflect coral reef conservation work government-wide. That includes increased federal funding for coral research, reef conservation, emergency response, and recovery efforts with a new focus on resiliency. Our bill sets forth concrete federal actions and policy changes to support coral reef conservation nationwide, including 1, strengthening the federal response to coral reef emergencies, including vessel groundings and natural disasters. 2, providing congressional authorization for the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force, bringing together all stakeholders. 3rd, directing actions to minimize damage to coral reefs at risk from invasive or nuisance species, vessel impacts, marine debris, and derelict fishing gear. 4th, provides additional federal grant making for local projects and research on coral reef biodiversity, genetics, resiliency, and other new grant categories. 5th, developing the first ever national guidelines for environmentally responsible artificial reefs. And the last, engaging our nation's marine laboratories, aquariums, sea grant colleges, and coral reef institutes as conservation partners. Nobody is against coral reef conservation. It's just simply not a priority for every member of Congress. So my job and your job is to get them to make it a priority. As you visit congressional offices this week, please ask your representatives to co-sponsor my bipartisan bill, the Coral Reef Conservation Reauthorization Act. Our bill enjoys support from every major ocean conservation, sport fishing, boating, aquarium, marine research, and stakeholder groups. For additional information on the bill, please contact my office or visit my website, berdalio.house.gov/coral. I am very encouraged by the work being done by the people here in this room in public policy, ocean conservation, marine research, coral genetics, and climate resiliency. It will take a sustained effort from all of us, government, nonprofits, the scientific community, aquariums, and private enterprise, working together to safeguard our nation's coral reefs. So thank you, all of you, for your valuable work and commitment to ocean and coral reef conservation. And as we say in Guam, si jus ma'ase. Thank you.
Again, I just want to thank the Congresswoman both for her comments and for her leadership on coral reef conservation. We are excited that she is working to reauthorize the Coral Reef Conservation Act. The National Marine Sanctuary Foundation strongly supports reauthorization to make sure communities and managers in science have the tools they need to conserve our coral reefs. So I'd like to invite our next group of panelists to the stage. And while everyone is getting seated, I would like to welcome our moderator, Nancy Knowlton. Dr. Knowlton is a bold leader for our oceans. She has led countless expeditions to explore the diversity of life underwater. She pushes the boundaries of communication and public outreach for science. And her recent Earth Optimism movement reminds the global conservation community to celebrate its success as well as to identify what is working. So without any further comments, I'll turn it over to Nancy. Thank you so much.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here today. I always like to have the opportunity to talk about coral reefs, and we're really fortunate to have an amazing panel, which I'll introduce in a second. You've heard, I'm sure many of you know the gory details about the threats that reefs face, and they were reviewed briefly, and also, of course, the importance, their economic importance, their biodiversity importance. And I think those of us of a certain age, I turned 69 last week, have been talking about this for decades, literally. And so in some ways, it's important to continue to remind ourselves of these things, but I think what's really new about this particular approach in this panel, and actually the entire Chow effort this week, is the increased emphasis on solutions and what is working or could work to actually make it so that 10 years from now we don't have to continue to say how important reefs are and how threatened they are. And I've, in a sense, my personal experience has been, has seen this whole history sort of unfold step by step. I was a graduate student on the north coast of Jamaica during the 1970s, and within 10 years, the reefs in Jamaica were essentially gone. And then 30 years later, I was on a reef in the Philippines where I swam with my hosts. I was a guest of the State Department, and literally in 1 hour, I didn't see a single fish during the dive. And so I've certainly seen the bad side of what's happened to coral reefs. But at the same time, on that same year, I spent a month on a ship in the Southern Line Islands where the bottom was literally covered with living coral, and the waters were full of large groupers and snappers and sea turtles and manta rays. And it's what we all dream about when we think about the Coral Reef Conservation Reauthorization Act. And even more recently, in fact, this past week, I've had an opportunity to really remind myself of some of the potential that we have with us. Right now, the National Academy of Sciences is doing an ad hoc study, a study of the potential for increasing the resilience of reefs. And we spent Thursday and Friday in Miami. In fact, one of our panelists was at that session, and the whole session was about the things that we could do to make things better and the things that we are doing. And those discussions ranged from how to choose places to restore reefs to some of the highest tech solutions involving genetic modification and observation systems and even geoengineering. And the goal of that study group is to lay out over the course of the next year what some of the options are, what the benefits and risks are. And I think it's incredibly important that the National Academy of Science, and this was a project sponsored by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, is really taking the steps to really focus on solutions. And then over the weekend, as a private citizen, I went to Cuba, and I was taken as a guest of a major hotel firm and also of an NGO in Cuba to the far western tip of Cuba, a place called Maria La Gorda. And there, on a dive, 2 dives in fact, I saw literally 1,000 2-meter snappers in a spawning aggregation, and I saw live cervicornis covering some of the reef stops. And that's something I've never seen a spawning aggregation, and I haven't seen large amounts of acropore cervicornis in longer than I care to remember. So just in the past week, in a sense, I've been reminded so vividly of the importance of what we're going to try to do with this panel. And so what I'd like to do now is introduce the speakers for the panel and let them make a few presentations, and then we'll be taking questions from all of you. I think you all have cards there, and have a real discussion. So the first presenter is Erin Muller. She's the science director of Mote Marine Laboratories' Elizabeth Moore International Center for Coral Reef Research and Restoration. And she's studied coral health and restoration and coral disease for 15 years around the world, with a particular focus in Florida, but also in places ranging from Indonesia and Saudi Arabia. And I think worth special mention is that she was the Young Scientist of the Year awardee from the International Society for Reef Studies in 2015. Only one such award is given every year. In 2015, that was you. Our next speaker is Luis Rocha. He's Associate Curator and Follett Chair of Ichthyology at the California Academy of Sciences, and he's a specialist on coral reef fishes. Really anything about coral reef fish you can ask Luis. He studies their evolution, conservation, taxonomy, community ecology, including not only the shallow ones most of us get to see, but also some really deep ones, and he'll be talking about that. He's spent more than 5,000 hours underwater, and his work has been featured by the New York Times, Wired, National Geographic, Smithsonian Magazine, among others. And then finally, we have Greg Asner, who's a faculty member in the Department of Global Ecology of the Carnegie Institution for Science, and also in the Department of Earth System Science at Stanford University. And he's not just a coral reef biologist, he also uses remote sensing methods to work on the conservation of forests. And he's also worked on the terrestrial carbon cycle. So he has a very broad portfolio but all of those pieces are united by the idea of collecting the information that allows us to make wise conservation decisions. And so, and then one final note, unfortunately Ruth Gate will not be able to join us today, but a number of us have relevant expertise, which we're gonna try to, I know Ruth quite well, as do several others, and we'll try to bring in some of the points that she would have made if she'd been able to join us. And so I think with that, we will start with Erin.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for coming today, and thanking for the panel for having me be a participant. I am a coral reef ecologist, and a lot of my research has focused on coral disease dynamics. And throughout the time that I've studied coral diseases, I've realized that there are variations within the population in the sense that some corals are more susceptible to disease than others. And that has really played a significant role leading into what my current research goals are, which is integrating resilience and resistance into restoration. So during a lot of my time, initially in grad work, I helped document some of the major declines in the US Virgin Islands from bleaching and disease outbreaks. And although that was incredibly important work, documenting the decline and never seeing a recovery was pretty depressing. What's great about my role now is that at Moat, we have a very different goal than documenting decline. It's the active change of that role from losing coral cover to recovering our coral reefs to a place where hopefully that they can sustain themselves on their own. And Moat has been a real leader over the last decade in coral restoration. And just to give you an example of what some of our nurseries look like, we can have staghorn and elkhorn nurseries offshore that hold 10 to 20,000 fragments at a time, representing about 100 different genotypes. And we also have land-based nurseries that focus on massive corals with over 40,000 fragments in propagation today. And so our restoration efforts are extremely large. We're having a great local impact within the Lower Keys and recovering some of the reefs that we've been able to outplant to. And we will be able to continue to do that over the years to come. But in this continued effort to recover our coral reefs from what they used to be or to help get them back to that point, we have to continue to battle a lot of these threats. Of course, coral bleaching, ocean acidification, but the most dire thing that's impacting the Florida reef tract today is a disease outbreak. Unfortunately, that started years ago in 2014, right off the coast of Miami. And over the last several years, it has continued to spread north and south, moving up the Florida reef tract on the southeast part of the state using the Florida current, and then following eddies down along into the Florida Keys and the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. To where it is today, it's actually at the Lower Keys, recently documented at Looe Key. And so we are trying to integrate disease resistance and resilience into our restoration plan as we move forward so that the corals that we put out there are more likely to survive as these disease outbreaks unfortunately continue to occur. This disease outbreak is incredibly unique in the sense that it's lasted so long, has affected over 20 different species of coral, some of them major reef building corals, and has not affected the acroporids. So putting that all into context, we have a very forward-thinking vision for a restoration plan, and that we hope to outplant at least 50,000 corals within the next year. We already have outplanted over 36,000 over the last several years. These will be diverse endemic coral species with genetic strains that nature already created to be heat tolerant or resistant to ocean acidification or disease resistance, but we also aim to increase genetic diversity through sexual reproduction events. We'll also continue our research on resilient coral, so understanding mechanisms of resistance, incorporating multiple threats and synergistic effects to some of this, and identifying the potential risks and trade-offs with this type of plan moving forward to do it in the most thoughtful way. And finally, we're going to be establishing a landlocked, secure living coral gene bank that we hope to keep genetic strains safe and secure from natural disasters, and hopefully secure the persistence of species that are in peril. Some corals that we have in the nursery and within our restoration actually don't exist in the wild anymore. So we're already inadvertently doing this, but we'd like to have a more focused effort. And with that, I would like to open that discussion and hopefully answer some more questions that you have related to our plan.
Thank you. Thanks for the organization, for having me here. It's a pleasure. So I'm going to take you guys a little deeper. And I want to do that during my introduction because that's the one opportunity I have to show you slides. But the system that I have been working on in a lot more detail recently, as opposed to all aspects of coral reef, has been this deeper portion of coral reefs that is very understudied. Just to give you an idea, every time we go explore those depths, which I'm talking about between 200 and 500 feet depth, we find new species of everything, of fish, of nudibranchs, of sea stars, of sea urchins, you name it. And so much so that I'm a fish biologist, so when I see a new species of fish, I kind of know almost immediately that it's new, but I don't know a thing about nudibranchs, and I just pick them up randomly, and sometimes I pick up new species. So it's the bottom, as you go past diving depths, normal diving depths, it becomes littered with novelty. And the reason for that is because most of the research that we have done so far has focused on the top 100 to 150 feet of coral reefs. As you get past that, it becomes more complicated to explore. By diving, you have to use technical diving. It costs more money, and if you want to do it by diving, it requires a lot of training. It's risky. It's not as easy as normal shallow diving. And if you want to do it with a submarine, it's really expensive because you have to have a platform, which is a ship, and that costs tens of thousands of dollars a day. So it's something that almost nobody does. Mostly because it's very hard to access. But there is still a lot of diversity there. The coral reefs used to grow there when the sea level was lower. So if you think during the last glacial period, which was just about 15,000 years ago, the sea levels were about 100, 200, maybe sometimes 300 feet lower than they were today. So if you think of a lower sea level like that, the reef that grows close to the surface used to be growing 300 feet below surface today. So when the sea level rose during the interglacial period that we are now, all of that reef got drowned, so that it became too deep for the coral to survive at those depths, but they left their skeletons behind. So all of that complexity, all of that structure is left behind, and it's taken advantage of by several different organisms that, for the most part, nobody knows about because nobody goes there. So we do go there. We do go there using closed circuit rebreathers, which is a very complex diving apparatus. You have to train for hundreds of hours before you can go to those depths to explore the reefs. And one of the first things we wanted to learn about those deep reefs was, are they a refuge? So when we talk about deep reefs, we know they're unknown, they're unexplored, and everybody assumes that they are unimpacted by humans, that nobody goes there, so they're untouched. They're a refuge, and there's a lot of things that live at those depths that could potentially recolonize the shallow reefs. So that's very important in the context of coral reef conservation. And this is the very first hypothesis we wanted to test there. And we did that by doing a lot of different things. We did a lot of surveys, we did a lot of collections, and we wanted to test the two assumptions behind that hypothesis that they are a refuge. The first assumption is that there's a lot of species overlap between the two depths. So it would only work as a refuge if the same species inhabited both shallow and deep reefs. And the second assumption is that those deep reefs are in fact intact. They're not reached by humans. There's no impacts. So we set out to test that. We traveled to dozens of different places in the planet. We counted more than 50,000 fish along those transects, up to 500 feet depth. So we did some dives that were 150 meters depth, for those of you that are metric inclined. I hope all the young ones are. We took hundreds of photos of corals from several different locations in the Caribbean, in the Indo-Pacific, and we're finding out more and more, our data is showing us that they're not a refuge, for two reasons. One of them is this. So these fish that you're looking at, they're not just eye candy, they're unknown. They have no names yet. None of those fish have names. These are some of the ones that we happen to have alive in our exhibit in the California Academy of Sciences. So sometimes we go for those places just for purely scientific purpose, and we just collect specimens and DNA samples and we do the transects, but sometimes we bring them back alive and we put them in an exhibit dedicated to those deep reefs. So they're unexplored. The other part of that is that nobody knows about them. So one of the things we're trying to do is raise awareness and show people that those deep reefs exist and that they host all of these beautiful, stunning, unique, undiscovered biodiversity. So the first assumption that says that there's a lot of overlap between shallow and deep reefs, we're seeing more and more that it's not the case, that there's a lot of unique, unknown species on those deep reefs. And the second assumption that they're not impacted, they're untouched by humans, we're also seeing that it's not quite the case. The picture on the left there is a picture that we took in the Bahamas recently. We were all geared up to go to the Bahamas to do this cruise. I don't know how many of you know about the lionfish invasion in the Caribbean, so it's a huge problem. There's an invasive species of lionfish that is eating up all of the natives. And we wanted to go out to the Bahamas to look at what those invasive lionfishes were doing into the were impacting the deep reefs, which again, nobody knows anything about. But 3 days before we were set out to go out on the cruise, Hurricane Matthew tore through the Bahamas, and it was unfortunate, but it gave us a very interesting data point. We were one of the first teams in the world to look at those deep reefs immediately after a hurricane had passed. And what we saw was that in the picture there was devastation. The reefs were smothered with sand that rained down on them from the shallow reefs. So a lot of people assume that hurricanes did not impact those deep reefs because most of the damage that you see in the shallow reef is from wave impact, from physical impact from waves created by the hurricanes. But the deep reefs, so all of that sand gets stirred up and that rains down on the deep reefs and then kind of drowns the coral there. And it kills a lot of things on its wake. The picture on the right there is, I took that in the Philippines. It's one of the deepest photos I took. That's about 150 meters depth, so 500 some odd feet. And that's a sea urchin. Those sea urchins, they live along the bottom, and they usually pick up anything that's around them to camouflage themselves. So they pick up seaweed and things like that to look like the bottom and camouflage themselves. So that sea urchin is attached to a fishing line, and that blue thing there is a piece of plastic, which makes it for good camouflage because there's plastic everywhere at 500 feet in the Philippines, amazingly. So what we're seeing more and more is that those deep reefs are suffering from the same impacts as the shallow reefs, and that they are unique. So that brings us full circle back into the main theme of the panel, which is coral restoration. So part of the coral reef research that we do at the Academy is purely exploratory, trying to find out what's going on at these deep reefs, but also part of it is trying to restore corals. And we do a lot of similar work that's being done at MOTE with coral restoration. We work with an organization called SEACOR. It stands for Sexual Coral Reproduction. We go out during coral spawning nights and we collect coral sperm and eggs. We put them together and then we make coral babies and we put them back in the reef. And we try to restore reefs using that method throughout the Caribbean. So we kind of do both ways there. We do the basic research and we do the coral restoration. And with that, I want to pass it to Greg.
It's great to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy, for moderating. I'm going to talk a little bit about the big picture and shallower waters. If you think about it, both on land and on the sea, I only have one slide, so I don't need this. On land and on the sea, the ecology of the planet is getting more and more fragmented. That's really what's happening. And this is true in the oceans as it is for tropical forests and anywhere else. And these drivers that we've heard about are behind that process. Those would be drivers of coastal development, overfishing, climate change. These kinds of drivers are fragmenting coral reefs. And when it comes to restoration or even scientific understanding, we actually have a pretty rough idea of what's going on in terms of the geography of our coral reefs over the planet's surface. We're talking about 200 million square kilometers of ocean with maybe a couple 100,000 square kilometers of actual reef. It's distributed in a very sparse, complex pattern that has not been easy to understand. Field work, we all do it, but zooming back out and kind of seeing what's happening has been pretty hard to do. And that affects our restoration processes. So there are two things I wanted to talk about today, very briefly. One I have a slide for. The other one is so new that it's been top secret and we just announced it yesterday. So if you haven't seen it on social media, please take a look. This one here is emphasizing the fact that there are new technologies that have come online in the last 5 years. Stuff is very new. They're airborne. They're not satellite-based. They allow us to do new things in terms of mapping reefscapes, areas of hundreds to thousands of square miles at a time that interface with conservation, management, restoration type activities to understand perhaps where to do better fieldwork, where to do better restoration outplantings of corals and so forth. The one you see on the screen happens to be my airborne laboratory called the Carnegie Airborne Observatory, named after the fact that I work at the Carnegie Institution for Science. This is a laboratory that's well known nowadays for its tropical forest work and its coral reef work. It carries the most advanced mapping technology in existence flying today. And one of those technologies, I won't go into it in detail, but it does allow us to fly over a reef, peel the seawater back digitally, and see the seafloor down to about 15 meters of water depth, or 50 feet. And that 0 to 50-foot water depth range is really critical because that's where a lot of the big impacts are occurring today. The technology doesn't allow to go any deeper anyway, and that's why we need Louise's program and many others like it to go deeper. But it is allowing us to see that shallow reef surface in unprecedented detail down to where the actual live corals are and other benthic or seafloor habitats, not just habitats, but the actual organisms that are there. The other one I want to mention is yesterday with Paul G. Allen Philanthropies, that's the co-founder of Microsoft, Paul Allen, and one of his organizations called Vulcan Inc. And a constellation of organizations that I'm very proud to be part of. We made a big announcement yesterday that we are, a group of us have come together to develop and deploy the first global high-resolution coral reef monitoring system. The organizations involved are Paul G. Allen Philanthropies and Paul Allen's Vulcan Inc. Also Planet Labs, now renamed Planet, which is an interesting satellite company that has 180 satellites in orbit today, making them the most voluminous satellite constellation in orbit for civilian use. And those data are coming into two scientific organizations, mine at the Carnegie Institution, where we've developed ways to process those satellite data to see the seafloor with more detail. Not the kind of detail that we can do from aircraft, but a big step forward in seeing where our reefs are, and critically, we'll be developing a coral reef bleaching monitoring system. Today, what we have is a hot water monitoring system that NOAA has deployed, really critical piece of the puzzle to see one of the critical drivers of reef change, where the hot water events are occurring in terms of sea surface temperature. What the new system that this partnership has come together to create will do is actually see the biology and its response to those hot water events, see how it's faring, find out where the survivors are, where the resilience and resistance is and is not. We don't really have a geography of that today. Another critical science partner in this is the University of Queensland. They have a lot of experience in this mapping technology. So they are going to lead a component that is to make the first static, high-resolution map of where our coral reefs are from 0 to 50-foot depth. And you would think we'd know that by now, but I can tell you that we really don't. We don't know it to plus or minus 50% accuracy today. We just kind of know where it is roughly. So that's going to be a major output of the program as well. And then a third really critical part, being led by Ruth Gates and the Hawaii Institute for Marine Biology, is an outreach and engagement program with coral reef stakeholders. They range from conservation organizations to management, state, federal, local, NGO, big NGO, small NGO, and everyone in between. This process is probably the hardest part of the program. The technology is going to support this engagement, but really it's going to take all of the people in this room and far beyond this room to engage this monitoring system. I'll just finish by saying we're rolling it out at 5 sites by October. And then from October through the rest of the year, we'll be expanding from those 5 sites. They're distributed around the planet, these 5 sites. Until about 2020, we should be actively monitoring all of the world's coral reefs at about 3-meter spatial resolution, up to daily coverage of these reefs, depending on cloud cover and so forth. So I think that's a major piece of this restoration and conservation puzzle that hasn't been there to give us that big picture view that's actionable with the biological detail that we all need. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks very much. We're going to start with the questions. I have some questions here from the audience. If you have questions you want to ask, we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. I'm going to start with one that sort of taps into all of your presentations because it's about the geography of hope and the geography of creating hope. One particular question came to Aaron, which is where you decide to put your fragments of corals that you're growing out on the reef. But and I'd like you to address that, but also in a broader perspective, I think all of us, and probably many of you have, and I alluded to in my introductory comments, some reefs that seem to be really promising or even largely unimpacted, at least from local threats, and others which are reef basket cases, which are in terrible shape. So, and you're going to give us data on which ones those are. You've told us, Luis, about things that were in worse shape than maybe we would have expected. So if you have, given that there's a finite amount of money and you have to prioritize, where do you put your conservation efforts? How do you make those hard decisions?
Right, so for us, there's been a lot of preliminary work that has gone into figuring out where the best sites are located for certain species, whether it's inshore to offshore in those reefs of the lower Florida Keys. So a lot of our initial effort was outplanting in different diverse areas and seeing how well these corals do through time. And we've kind of honed that down, especially within the staghorn corals, to locate particular offshore reefs where when we put the corals out, we have over 90% survival rate for years to come. And even within the reefscape, we've identified certain geographic features that confer survivorship. So like along a reef edge or a reef area that comes down, I mean, those corals always survive better than others. But in general, we've had great success within our outplanting reef systems where we routinely have over 90% survival rate. Even the microfragments that we put out, which are the massive species, we put them out in very inshore locations so far. And as Irma rolled through a direct hit over us, we still had almost 100% survival of those corals. So we're still like refining some of those details, but we've got it down pretty well within our region. And we're collaborating with universities that are looking at a larger reef scale, like the Florida Reef Track scale, to pick up and identify certain ecological or environmental factors that are kind of key features that give us information that the corals that we put out there are going to survive better. So we're kind of in the process of doing that, but so far been very successful.
Yeah, that's one big part of the puzzle there is trying to find a place where the corals are going to survive. So I mentioned the work we do at the California Academy of Sciences with the organization called SEACOR. We're working up phase 2 of that work. So the first phase of the work was trying to develop new technologies and trying to scale up the amount of coral babies that we put back in the wild. The second phase is going to focus on exactly this question, on trying to figure out which areas are the best for attain the best result possible, which is recovering coral reefs. And we think that they're neither going to be the pristine areas nor the heavily impacted areas. They're probably going to be the areas where they're going to have the greatest chance of reseeding other coral reefs. So it's impractical to think that we're going to restore every coral reef in the entire Caribbean system. But we can pick a few islands that are on a position in relation to a current that are upstream from other islands. And if we recover the reefs there, they're going to generate more larvae that are going to reseed other corals down the line. So that's where our current thinking is right now, is trying to identify source populations that we can restore. And then those are probably going to kind of restart a natural process going throughout the reefs.
Greg?
Yeah, I'll just add that I generally describe this as trying to find, in terms of finding habitat to work with people who do restoration, it's kind of like working with the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good areas are areas that are still intact. You might place maximum protection there. They may not need restoration. Jumping to the ugly, they could be so far gone for lots of reasons that it would be tough to figure out how to restart those or jumpstart those areas. It's that middle zone, the quote bad, where there's a lot of activity. They're not bad, they just have had some degradation. And the kind of mapping that we're doing and our colleagues are doing is really looking for those particular habitats, not just finding them geographically with the aircraft in this case, but then asking why are those habitats where they are? Do they have to do with depth only or wave dynamics or distance to different types of coastal development and so forth? And it's usually a complex combination of those. For example, we're working heavily in the Dominican Republic. This is an area that has a brand new, massive marine sanctuary that's just been announced about 3 months ago. We were brought in straight away by the Nature Conservancy to do the mapping of this marine sanctuary specifically for this process of finding the areas that, okay, where are the intact coral reefs? And I'm happy to say there were large areas of intact reef there, confirmed later in the field. Areas of severe degradation, the ugly areas, but that area that's in between, that's really ripe for restoration, that's where a lot of the emphasis is occurring in the fusion of the kinds of work that Aaron and Louise are talking about and the kind of work that I'm talking about. That's where it comes together, places like marine sanctuaries and special projects like that at this point.
Thanks. I have another question. This panel, all of us are scientists, but scientists working at the interface between basic and applied science and trying to provide science that's relevant for conservation. So if you could quickly, because I want to get through as many questions as possible, if you had, say, one question that, or one technique that you need that you don't have yet, that, for example, you'd like to communicate to policymakers in light of the Coral Reef Conservation Act that's being proposed, or an NGO, what's most standing in your way in terms of the science behind what you're trying to achieve?
So I'll start with that one, I guess. Well, I think kind of the Australian effort right now is pretty impressive. So over the last couple of years, the Great Barrier Reef has suffered quite a bit of loss, over 50% just from back-to-back coral bleaching events. And right away, we get this really strong federal financial support response from the government of Australia with over $400 million going towards research and restoration. Within the US, we've been watching corals decline for decades, as Nancy can attest to firsthand. And that kind of level of response hasn't been observed within that decline. And we're at a critical point right now, especially within the Florida Reef Tract, where we have this disease outbreak that's, it's a natural disaster. It is extremely detrimental to what we have left on that reef scale. And what we need now is more funding for research and restoration to try and get the reef tract back into a place where it could potentially recover over time. Because if we just continue to watch it, it's not going to come back within a time frame that we think is acceptable.
Any other?
Yeah, I think for us right now, the biggest impediment is probably trying to figure out where those source populations are. So we need better methods and quicker and easier and maybe more people even studying the questions of where those source populations are, using genetics, using oceanography, using modeling, using all tools possible just to try to find out where those best sites or aerial technology, where those best sites are end up going to be.
I would just emphasize scalability. We need emphasis on the scaling of these efforts. The kind of efforts that Moat and Cal Academy and many others are doing need support to scale up. My part of the community provides one piece of that puzzle, but we need much more of that, both intellectual capital and financial capital to make that happen.
And I have another question that's relevant because none of you mentioned the social sciences in your answer. And I have a question from a member of the audience saying that hard sciences have always had problems with social sciences. I'm not sure I agree with that statement, but I was wondering, I personally have spent decades working with social scientists, and I used to always tell my students that the saving whales involves the changing behavior of people, not the changing behavior of whales. So I'd like your thoughts on where the social sciences might play a role here. Any order, we can break up, let's change the order.
Go around, yeah. I mean, I got my start in Hawaii, and I've had the benefit of working from very local community scales, including Native Hawaiian community scales, up to federal government type activities. And the social science of that is challenging. I find that when it comes down to a reefscape, a place like the Hawaiian Islands, that there's much more work that needs to be done in integrating local knowledge, communities, whether they're indigenous or not, with larger scale processes that might be funded by the federal government or state government. So there's a social science to that I kind of end up in the middle of a lot as a scientist and try to navigate and support, but there needs to be a lot more effort in that role because these reefs are really scattered around, and they end up having communities there day in and day out. That's where the rubber meets the road, or the fins meet the water, whatever you want to call it. That's where things happen, and that social science structure, that interface, needs to be put front and center.
Yeah, it's a very complex question, and I grew up in Brazil, so I grew up in coastal communities, and I know it's very hard to go to a local fisherman and tell them, oh, by the way, you can't fish anymore. And I think I've seen a myth being propagated recently that is very concerning to me, is that there's a lot of people saying that local artisanal fisheries are good, and that's not the case at all. I mean, they can be as destructive as large-scale industrial fisheries if they're not done sustainably, and in many places they're not done sustainably. Yeah, I've seen this trend that everybody, when they talk about coral reefs, they say, oh no, we're just going to stop with the industrial fisheries, and we're going to allow the local artisanal fisheries to continue. But when you look at it in detail, 99.9% of all the fisheries in coral reefs is artisanal. There's no big industrial boats sitting on top of a coral reef dragging a net through it. It's not physically possible. Everything is done with a hook and line or a spear, and reefs can be destroyed with that. So it's a fine line, and it's hard. Just a little background. I think, and this one is interesting too, from both the social and the biological perspective. But two of the best reefs I've ever seen, three of the best reefs I've ever seen in my entire life, and I've been countless hours in the water. I've done many, many field trips. But those three reefs were in Somalia, Djibouti, and Socotra, Yemen. And when you think of coral reefs, you do not think of those places. But I think they have a combination of characteristics that make them unique in many ways. Not only oceanography in biological perspective, but also in the social perspective. They happen to be some of the poorest places I've ever been to, so that the local populations, they don't have access to an engine to put in their boats, or to modern fishing techniques, or to a GPS, or to a sonar, a fish finder. They don't have any of that. So the fisheries there is traditional local fisheries. The moment you put an engine in a boat, or you have a mask and a spear in your hand, I don't think that's tradition anymore. In addition to that, they're very close to the pirates in Somalia. So the pirates keep all of the illegal fisheries out. So you have this combination of very low impact local fisheries with protection from pirates, or delivered by pirates, which makes them the best reefs I've ever seen. So go figure.
Go pirates.
Exactly.
Well, and at Mo, We are, as a nonprofit, completely independent, incredibly integrated within our community, and we have several citizen science programs that focus on coral reefs and coral reef research. So we have Sea Ocean and Bleach Watch. These are both citizen science programs where we rely on the community, whether it's scuba divers or fishermen or people out just enjoying the water, to provide us information on what's going on within their reefs that they're visiting. And the community feels really comfortable reporting that to us. Maybe they're a little hesitant about reporting it to the federal government or the state government, but they have a safe place with Moat to talk about whatever they're seeing on the water. In addition, I get the wonderful opportunity to work with this group that's right here in the front, the Scuba Nauts. So this is an incredibly powerful group of high school students that their focus is on learning about marine science and scuba diving and research. And they're going to be in the Keys in a couple weeks from now, working with our restoration program and the combat wounded veterans, partnering to do some of that active restoration of our coral reefs within our backyards. So having citizen scientist groups like this is incredibly important to how Moat functions, and they're actually going to be out doing some disease surveys for us too, to inform us as to where that disease front is moving within the Keys. So we continuously tap into all of these great organizations of all ages. We call it K to Gray, and they're incredibly important in our research endeavors.
Thanks. I have a question that's actually come up quite a bit in the context of this National Academies of Sciences study group that I mentioned at the outset. And it has to, the question has to do with sewage and plant discharges in agricultural and urban runoff, but it also, of course, relates a little bit to what Luis said about overfishing and how you deal with overfishing. And the general issue is, you know, how can we make progress in restoring reefs, even if we were successful in dealing with finding, for example, genetic types that were really resistant to global warming or ocean acidification. Where does the sort of nitty-gritty, boots on the ground work on reducing the conventional local threats that have been with us literally for decades and in some places centuries, how do we retain excitement and scientific energy in these what seem to be more conventional threats, but which potentially make anything we want to do for climate change or ocean acidification impossible in terms of achievement?
Okay, I'll start. I do a lot of work in the Philippines. I've been there 10, 15 times, and I've seen some very successful attempts to do exactly that, to remove some of those local threats, and at the same time, keep the local population busy and happy and with an income. I mean, just not coming in and saying you can't fish here anymore. And that's done mostly by converting relatively small areas, but many small areas, into marine reserves, and shifting gears from a fishing extractive based community into a tourism-based community that charges fees to the divers to come into their protected areas, and then they use the money, the income from their fees to support the communities. And that has worked in places like the Philippines. It's not a solution for everything because tourism is also very carbon heavy and intensive, so it has to be done the right way. But it's one of the ways to remove the local threats. Other ways are just what these kids are doing, just education and waiting for the next generation, and hoping that they're going to do a better job than we've done so far.
Other comments?
I'm not totally sure about the question anymore because I was thinking about something Luis said.
That's fine.
You know, it's interesting to see, for example, this is where social science and natural science and physical science come together, the hotel industries and the tourism industries. Working in the Caribbean quite a lot and also in the Pacific, I'm just more recently seeing conglomerates or associations of hotels coming together and seeing that their activities have damaged reefs, this pollution issue, eutrophication and so forth, golf courses nearby and that kind of thing. and efforts to try to not just champion like greenwash champion, but actually do things about it, because their industry relies on the same environments that we care about. And so I'm seeing that movement in the last some years now, and I think that gives me a lot of hope. And also it is pumping dollars into this conservation process, because fees are being charged for access to these beaches and coastal areas and ocean resources. So I don't know exactly if that answers your question, but that's an area that I think is ripe for expansion, this public-private partnership type of approaches for engaging what has been a problem source industry and turning it around and actually making them champions and enforcers of improved water quality and water conditions.
Yeah, and water quality, I mean, that's a tough one to tackle, but the evidence that I've seen in the Keys has been really empowering, in the sense that we definitely had a big sewage issue with septic tanks leaking out into the water, and that has largely been replaced with large-scale treatments on the Key scale. Within South Florida, I think that is an incredibly challenging position, because you have the reefs right there next to millions of people right off of Miami. And so that is a continuous major threat going on for those corals that are right there. And we just need to continue to advocate for some of those locally managed things that we could actually change, whereas some of the global issues are much more harder to tackle on that type of a spatial scale.
So I have a number of questions that have to do with sort of the technical aspects of what some of your presentations. And so I'm going to bring them together and ask you, say, if you were to look 10 years in the future, what do you, I mean, some of these questions have to do with synthetically replicating coral spawning. I have a question here about coral mapping, where it could go, and all sorts of questions about genetic modification and where we might see that happen. So my question is, where do you, if things go well, the world's still with us 10 years from now, what do you think we'll be able to do 10 years from now that we're not able to do today?
Well, right now in the restoration text, which a lot of those kind of mentioned, we're not in the forefront looking at any type of genetic modification of corals. What we aim to do is increase genetic diversity and do that as thoughtfully as possible with corals that we know are going to be more likely to survive in the future. So this is a kind of an extreme example, but within the Lower Keys region where we're working, we have about 65 genotypes of staghorn coral within our nursery, and there's not really any wild corals left to harvest from that area anymore. They're gone. And so our goals over the next several years are to increase that sexual reproduction effort of these corals that we have in stock within this region, to increase genetic diversity, and do that with corals that we know are going to be more likely to survive in the future, but also incorporating those corals that maybe we don't know are super special right now, because we can't obviously predict every event that's going to threaten the corals in the future. So we are trying to move forward by integrating those two really important ecologically viable options to put corals back out onto the reef, which we know we can do. We know we can do it thoughtfully, and we're just developing the right strategy to make it the most effective over the next decade.
Yeah, so putting together what you said to some of what Greg said, so what we're doing at the Academy to scale up restoration is we just launched a month ago. We finished building, and we brought back corals from Palau into a coral spawning lab. It's like a closet, maybe not bigger than this area that we're sitting here, but it's completely temperature controlled and light regime controlled, and we brought back pregnant corals from Palau about 2 weeks before they were due to spawn, and we replicated the light regime of Palau inside that little closet. It looks like a photography development closet, so it's completely sealed, and we can keep the lights there, and we can replicate moon phases and things like that. And we did induce the coral to spawn, and they spawned, and we created little babies in the coral lab. And what we're hoping to do with that is scale it up, is trying to find where the bottlenecks are, because there are bottlenecks. When we go out on those coral spawning nights, we collect millions of eggs and sperm, and not a big enough proportion of them makes it back to the reef. So we want to increase that proportion. We want to scale it up. So where I kind of want to see it in 10 years is scaling this up as much as possible.
Nancy, as an aging biologist who hangs out with a lot of really high-tech people, I've learned not to predict 10 years, but 5, okay? And 10, who knows? 5, in my world, in this field that I am, my community, my part of this community, you know, I just announced that we're going to have the first coral reef monitoring system. It's going to use technology that's available today, and it's an innovative technology. What we have on aircraft is far more capable. And what I see in the next 5 years is the fusion of those technologies so that the stuff that's on aircraft today, 5 years from now, will be in Earth orbit. What does that get us? More than just where the reefs are and whether they're bleaching, but actually how corals are doing in terms of their life and death cycles. So I think we're moving that way. In 5 years, we'll be seeing that happening at large scales. A second one is in data informatics. It's amazing. And the work that goes on from divers to satellites, there's a huge amount of development space there. If you're a data scientist or a computer scientist and don't like getting in the water but care about coral reefs, that's a major place to be and to be active. I think the next 5 years we're going to see some mind-blowing integration of the types of observations that are made by divers up to the types of observations that are made by satellites, and the integration of that in a useful capacity for conservation and management.
So I have 2 quick questions, which I think would be great just to answer in literally 15 seconds each, because one's to you, Aaron. Do you know what diseases are killing the coral off Florida? Do you know the cause?
No and no.
Okay. I thought that would be quick.
Less than 15 seconds.
We think it's a bacterial
Yeah.
infection. It responds to antibiotics in a laboratory setting, suggesting it's bacterial. Haven't identified the pathogen yet, but we're working on it.
And I have a question for you, Greg. What are the 5 reefs for initial monitoring with the new satellite technology?
Yes, they are public information now. Southern part of the Great Barrier Reef, centered on Heron Island. Part of the Belize Barrier Reef, actually the atoll offshore called Lighthouse Reef. West Hawaii, the big island of Hawaii, which has a 300-kilometer-long reef, one of the biggest in the state. A spot in Indonesia, and did I hit 5 yet? No.
It's all right.
Moorea.
Okay.
Moorea. And Moorea.
Thank you.
In French Polynesia.
And then one quick technical question for you, Luis. It has to do with, is there any, you say that the deep reefs are different than the shallow reefs, but is there a zone of interaction where they sort of come together and might interact with each other?
There is about between 100 and 150 feet, we see somewhat of a mix between the shallow and the deep fauna. The deeper you go, the more different it gets.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to some more general questions. And I have a question that has to do with what the average person can do to make a difference. And then I have another question about what policymakers and legislators could do to make a difference. So if there is anything you could ask from the general public, what they could do to make a difference, what would that be? And then what do you need actually in terms of policy support, either helping or getting out of the way in terms of what you're trying to accomplish? So there's 2 questions, really.
I'll just say that what we heard from the Congresswoman was key. I thought it was really important to hear that there isn't, I think she said there isn't pushback against coral reef restoration and related matters. It's that people aren't prioritizing it. And so what we need is a lot more help communicating this. We need it from everyone and from all levels. To me, that's one of the critical pieces that I heard from her speech this morning, or before we came on stage.
And and that's something that both policymakers and the general public could do more of, yes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know how many of you were in the media panel just before this, but I think they said something that was really interesting, really powerful, is that every one of us today has a media device in our hands or somewhere, and we can amplify the message a lot. Even if you just have, I don't know, 10 followers on Twitter, it's 10 followers on Twitter. It's better than nothing. So you can make your opinion known. You can amplify other people's messages. You can talk about it. You can be passionate about it. And when you influence somebody else, you're doing something. Plastics, to me, is another big thing that it can be done. It can be solved at an individual level. In terms of policy, I think the biggest thing that has to be done is climate change. It's the big issue right there. I mean, in the end, all of what we're talking about coral restoration, it's not going to work if we don't solve climate change. We can delay the demise of coral. We can keep them going for a while we solve climate change, but if we don't solve it, that's it. But I still hope we can solve it and we can keep corals going in the meantime.
Yeah, and I echo all that. The biggest thing I think our young people can do is be advocates for restoration, for research, and for climate change policies. And that, you know, you're a powerful voice and people are listening. So that now is the time to be those advocates. And I think one of the questions was, is there anything in the way within, you know, policymakers and legislation? And we're working very closely with many of our federal partners and streamlining the permitting process, and that kind of oiling that up and making that more feasible is something that we're continuing to work on with our federal and state agencies.
Yeah, one of the comments that was made during the National Academy meetings was actually something along the lines of, you need just one permit to take something out of the water, but 5 permits to put it back in the water. Yeah, and certainly a lot of restoration is going to involve putting things in the water as well as taking it out. I have a question here, which I think has been partially addressed, which is what gives you hope? Because many of you have talked about you know, the things that are online or in progress. But I want to connect this to another question, which has to do with communication, which you've all alluded to as well. And I know I certainly get this question a lot. When you talk about what's working, this whole hashtag Ocean Optimism Twitter campaign that we launched a couple of years ago, there's this tendency to the typical pushback that I certainly get is, how can you talk about hope? How can you talk about what's working when there's so many problems? And we all know in this audience and certainly on the stage that there are huge problems. And in fact, things are in general, it's safe to say, still getting worse. It's not to say that they wouldn't be even worse if we weren't doing some of the things we're doing, but it's still a pretty sobering prospect. And so I'm curious how you balance that message of hope and urgency, and how you get that right so that people don't say, oh, well, it's all solved, or the scientists have got it under control. I don't have to worry about any of the things that they tell me that I'm doing that aren't good for coral reefs.
Well, what gives me hope definitely are those before and after pictures when a restoration group has gone through and put corals back out. And you don't just see corals back out onto a reef. You see invertebrates recruiting to that area. You see fish recruiting back to that area, and the functionality of that reef coming back. And it's incredibly amazing to see that restoration work. And that gives me hope because we have tools at our fingertips to make a change like that. Instead of having to sit and document the decline, we have the resources and the tools to make a difference. And that's empowering and powerful, and something maybe 10 years ago I didn't feel like I had. So that's what helps me sleep every night.
Yeah, I think I just saw on Twitter earlier that Hawaii announced that they're going to be carbon neutral, or they're pushing for being carbon neutral. That's the things that give me hope, is acts like that. I mean, as much as I hate congratulating politicians, because when you do that, you invariably make the issue political. In this case, I want to congratulate whoever influenced Hawaiian government to do that. Yeah, and obviously the restoration before and after, a great example. But also everywhere I go, I still find pockets, even in the most impacted places, you still find pockets of high diversity, good-looking, pristine reefs. So they are a resilient ecosystem. They'll make it.
Yeah, my answer is partially as a biologist. That's right, refugia. There are these refugia out there, and the Earth system is not, it's hard to extinguish life completely in the Earth system. If you know about Earth history, you can appreciate that, so that gives me hope. The second part, it does. There are a lot of refugia out there in coral reefs. The other one is, I get the most hope out of this knowledge innovation that's coming out, and it's coming out of younger and younger people. And it's not just that I'm getting older and older. They're definitely coming out of younger and younger people. So that gives me the most hope and a big smile.
Well, I was reminded actually when you were talking about my misstatement of asking for a 10-year time frame rather than a 5-year for when, at least in your field, of a quote from Bill Gates, which is that we always overestimate the amount of change that will take place in 2 years and underestimate the amount of change that will take place in 10, which I think is, the statement was made in a completely different business sort of planning for the future, taking your business forward, but it applies so clearly to conservation, in my opinion, and the importance of not letting setbacks on the 2-year scale discourage you from what might be and is likely to happen on the 10-year scale. I think we're getting close to time now. 5 minutes, perfect. So I have a last question for you. And a number of you have said what we need to do is scale it up. But you have not said too much about how to scale it up. So I'm going to pressure you specifically what you think you could do to get this idea of making something, taking all these small-scale successes and bigger, what you think it will take, and in particular, what is the potential for collaboration? I know there was one question that I didn't specifically ask in the relevant to these genotypes, and the idea was there any other gene banking sort of things going on with corals. But in a much broader sense, how could we do a better job of taking small scale to the regional and even global scale with respect to reef restoration, which you've all said is absolutely crucial? And where do you see opportunities for working together?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of great initiatives that are kind of young in their development and have already taken big steps forward. One is the Coral Restoration Consortium. This is a group of non-government entities, government entities, universities, all working together to collaborate and share best practices and to move forward with how to do this type of restoration on a regional scale. It's focused right now in Caribbean and Atlantic, but there's members from all around the world. And within that Restoration Consortium, there's working groups focused on genetics, scaling up, collaborating further, integrating island nations. And so that has been a great resource and a tool for collaboration. And NOAA is also leading a very strong initiative for tackling some of that scaling up feasibility. We can do a great job with what we have right now, but being able to tap into other fields, whether it's the farming industry, the engineering industry, and collaborate with people that think outside of our box. That's what this working group is focused on, and that's gonna hopefully bring in some novel technologies, some new applications to take what we have developed and be able to implement it very quickly within a larger regional scale.
I think I'm going to again borrow from the two of you. I think, yeah, absolutely, scaling up is the best thing we can do right now. In addition to scaling up the technology, something that we definitely need to do is involve more nations, more communities, and more people in it.
How would you do that?
So the effort that we're doing right now in the Caribbean, Sea Corps is only focused on Curacao, Mexico, the Bahamas. They were going to start a program in St. Croix, but that got derailed by hurricanes and things. So there's always those kinds of things. And in the end of the day, to kickstart those programs, what we need is funding. So more funding to scale up is the big bottleneck. And it's not just government funding or donations. It's one example that I've been seeing that was really interesting that just happened in Mexico was a partnership between the Nature Conservancy, the local government, and insurance companies of all things. They managed to convince the insurance companies that if they invested in coral reef restoration, there would be less impact from storms, and they'd have to pay less money for damages in the future. And now the insurance companies in Mexico are heavily investing in coral restoration, which is absolutely incredible. So I think initiatives like that would scale up coral restoration enormously.
Yeah, I'd add that even if we had all the money that we needed,
Still need that.
the science side of this, we have a lot to do in terms of understanding how to bridge scales. There's a lot to do there. Especially the younger scientists in the audience, don't think we have this figured out. This is trial and error, this is pieces and parts. We actually need a unified approach, and we actually have to ultimately deal with these coral reefs from the largest scales, but with the finest biological detail at all times. And we're just not there scientifically, sociologically, financially, or policy-wise. So there's a lot to do there, and those are barriers that we have to continue to work at moving forward.
Right, I think we're almost out of time, sadly. It's been really an honor and a pleasure to be on stage with 3 people who are really making a difference for coral reefs. So I want you to thank them for sharing their time. I want to thank you all for your questions, which were actually very, very good questions. My apologies to those I didn't get to, but I tried to get as many of them as I worked in as possible. Thank you for the organizers, and also thank you to Representative Bordallo, who shared with us some very interesting information, what's happening legislatively on the Hill right now. So thank to all of you for making this today.